Thought today we would talk about transmissions. No, not the transmission of a virus, but the transmission behind your engine. We're in a later model JK with a L86 8L90 transmission. And the 8L90, as you guys know, has turned out to be a great transmission. It definitely had some bugs in the beginning, and this is an early transmission. This was actually a 15 transmission supplied by the customer way back when. I think this was the second 8L90 that we did, and we had to fight some of the same issues that GM did, and that was the herky-jerky shifting. When you come to a stop, there was a clunk, and just odd shifting in general. Now, with most of the 14 and 15 transmissions, we could update the programming and the software and get rid of most of that. But in this particular case, the customer chose to replace the transmission, which we did. GM has updated and superseded the early transmissions to the later ones. And this is something that GM actually did in their production vehicles also. So we're mimicking exactly what GM did. This also illustrates the issues that GM had with the 8L90 when it was first introduced. Now, if you look at the positive side of the 8L90, it's an extremely strong transmission. It can handle over 750 foot-pounds of torque. It has excellent gear diversity, and now that we're getting these early 8L90s dialed, they shift like butter. On the highway, this thing is a dream. I'm cruising along right now at 70 miles an hour at 1800 RPM, and I'm giving it no throttle basically. It's just sailing along here. One of the things that the customer mentioned was off-road performance, where it had some odd shifting in 4-low, and that is actually something I've seen in other early 8L90s. We don't really see that problem with the later 8L90s, only with the earlier ones. So we're going to go out to the mountain and we're going to do a little bit of testing on this early 8L90. Now, this 8L90 has been superseded to the newer hardware, so we should be able to get it pretty darn good. Maybe before we talk about the 8L90, we should go back and look at the roots of the automatic transmission. After World War II, automatics were in demand because women and men that didn't want to drive with a stick just wanted something more convenient, and Hydramatics and other transmissions came out. They were all over the map. There were some Buicks with overdrives, and there were 2 speeds, 3 speeds, but really it was the Hydromatic for GM that changed things. You all know about the Turbo 350 and the Turbo 400. Ford had their C6s and Chrysler had their 727s. By the 1960s, the market switched over from manuals to automatics. Now, of course, there's still a lot of manuals available in the 1960s, but by the end of the 60s, most family vehicles and business vehicles switched over to the automatics. Throughout the 60s and 70s, which is basically the time I grew up, the 3-speed automatic became the standard. As I mentioned, Chrysler 727s, GM had their 350s and 400s, and they were very ambiguous, those 350s and 400s. They were not only used by GM, they were used by a lot of different manufacturers, including Rolls-Royce. Mopar had some great transmissions also. I always found that the Mopar transmissions shifted hard. Back in those days, everything was pretty much mechanical. So you had shift kits and valve body modifications, but I remember some old Torque Flight transmissions that you'd have to grit your teeth when the thing shifted. So Detroit pretty much cruised along throughout the 60s, 70s, and even the early 80s with their 3-speed transmissions. They weren't very efficient. Compared to a manual transmission, they didn't get the same mileage. You lost horsepower because of the internal friction and drag. You created heat. So there was no doubt that these transmissions needed some updating. In the early 80s, most of the manufacturers started adding an overdrive gear to their transmissions. You've all heard of the Turbo 700. Now, the Turbo 700 was a predecessor to the 4L60E, E standing for electronic. The 700R4 was basically a mechanical transmission, but they did add a torque converter lockup eventually, and that was electronically controlled. Of course, Chrysler added some 4-speeds to their lineup, and unfortunately the JK was burdened with one of those transmissions. The 42 RFV was never really that great of a transmission, and it suffered from the same deficiencies of the other transmissions of its era, which was high friction, high drag, high heat, and the diversity of the gearing was really not that much better than the 3-speeds. You still had about a 3-to-1 first gear, but they added an overdrive at about 0.8, so that did help on the highway. What it also allowed you to do was effectively run a shorter gear or a more performance gear and still have a good highway cruise. Now, in today's world, we are dropping down below 4-to-1, 4.5-to-1, 4.7-to-1 on the first gear, which means we don't have to sacrifice the gearing. We can stay with a tall gear, and if you look at what GM is doing, they're running 323s, 321s, 308s, or whatever the ratio is in the low 3s and even the high 2s in these heavy vehicles. And that is the key to torque management. We'll talk about that. But by dropping that first gear down in ratio means we can still maintain that launch performance and still have a good highway cruise. So let's go back to the 80s and let's talk specifically about the GM transmissions, and we'll mention a few things about the Chryslers. The Turbo 700 evolved into the 4L60E and its heavy-duty counterpart, the 4L80. They were great transmissions, but they were also from an earlier era. I got a call from a guy yesterday wanting to put a 4L60 in his JK. We actually did that. We did several builds with the 4L60, and if you watch my previous videos, you know that the 4L60 does not have a TCM inside the valve body, so it ran an external TCM. It ran the T42 controller. So like the Gen 3 engines, all the wires had to run between the controller and the transmission. All the operating wires for the solenoids and the internal mode switch and the park neutral and all the other stuff. So there's just a mess of wires that go outside of the transmission to a controller. And GM did have some problems with all those wires in the tunnel, rubbing, exhaust system, oil, and everything else that would contaminate them. I really liked the fact that the 6L80 had the internal TCM where all that was protected, and really all we had to run to the transmission was the CAN communication wires and some power and grounds and maybe a backup for the brake switch because the DOT wants that. What we have to recognize here is we've made massive improvements in engine performance, and we cannot ignore the improvements in the transmission because the transmission is a key and integral part not only of the emission system, and remember, if you're going to do an engine swap and you want to stay legal, the transmission is part of that emissions package. So hybriding or running a non-stock transmission like a manual behind a vehicle that came with an automatic is technically not compliant. I've had many customers drive our conversions with a 6-speed 6L80, and they've had 5-speed Hemis or 4-speed JKs and bought the LS conversion, not because of the LS engine, but because of the transmission. They like the tap shift mode. They like the lightning quick clutch to clutch shifting. So guys drive these new generation transmissions and say, wow, this thing runs great. And they're not so much referring to the engine, they're referring to the transmission. While the Hemi is a large cast iron engine, if the Hemi had a better transmission in the early days, it could have performed better against the LS. The old 545 RFE was really a bad transmission. It was high heat, it had some timers that didn't know what gear it wanted to be in. A lot of guys loved their engine but hated that transmission, so they went to an LS. Now things pretty much stayed status quo in the 90s and we limped along with the transmissions that we had. By the 2000s, there was a lot of gains to be had. GM introduced the 6L80 in the mid-2000s, and in my book, it was a game changer. When they introduced the 6L80, it pretty much obsoleted everything that came before it. Every customer that did a 4-speed build with us in the early days switched over to the 6-speed after they drove one. We went to a 4-to-1 low first gear, and that's huge for us Jeepers because now we could run 40s with tall gears and still have good launch performance. The 6L80 is strong. The 6L80 is low friction. Not only does that mean you lose less horsepower, but you also have less heat generated. It really was a game changer. And when they put that transmission behind the LS engines, even the 5.3, it was a massive leap. Double-digit improvements right across the board. I did 5.3 6L80 conversions in the mid-90s GM trucks that had the 5.7 engines with a 4-speed, and customers reported almost double the horsepower. That's right, 180 horsepower to 320-ish horsepower. And the 6-speed transmission allowed these vehicles to get 15, 16, 17 miles to the gallon, even when towing, where the earlier engine couldn't hold a candle to that. It really was a major shift in engine performance. So the 6L80 was pretty much king for a decade. 2007 to 2017, the 6L80 was not only viable, but it was still used by GM. Even when GM introduced the Gen 5 engine, they stayed with the 6L80. Around 2014, GM decided to add a couple of more gears to the Hydromatic lineup, and it only made sense. Engine technology started to kick in. Remember, by this time they had direct injection, high compression, continuous variable valve timing, and all the other technology in the LTs. It was obvious that more gains were to be had in the transmission. Now, for a lot of years, the guys with smaller displacement engines or diesels knew that high gear transmissions were the ticket. And the reason is those engines either have narrow power bands like a diesel. A diesel likes to run at a specific RPM. That's where it's most efficient. So the more time you can keep it at that specific RPM, the more efficient it's going to be. Smaller displacement engines act similarly. They have a power band they want to be in. And by having more gears, you can keep it in that power band longer. For a long, long time, the good old American V8 ruled because not only did it have displacement, but it had torque, it had long legs. So you could get away with a lower gear transmission and still have great performance. Back in the 70s, when I really got into engine conversions, people were still running the 2-speed Power Glide. And on the track, especially in drag racing, it was a popular transmission. It was easily modified, it was relatively strong, and the 3-speeds really didn't come in into their own until later on. Chrysler made a somewhat belated attempt with the 5-speed, the 545 RFE, but in my opinion, that is a transmission you should avoid if you can. Chrysler did go to the W8 580, which was a big step up from anything Chrysler had, but it was essentially a big step up because what they had was crap. So back to the 6L80, it really was a game changer, and the 6L80 still, in my opinion, is a viable transmission. It can get you good economy. It is strong. The 6L80 did have some issues early on, 7, 8, and 9. By 2010, GM had it sorted, and I'm still dealing with guys that are buying 7 and 8 transmissions and 12 engines. You want to match your engine to your transmission, guys. If you get a 7 engine, get a 7 transmission. My advice is don't get a 7 engine, get a 10 and up. And it's not because they're bad engines, it's because if you get a 10 and up, all the bugs have been worked out, everything is compatible, they're easier to tune, it's just better all the way around. So from about 2010 to 2020, GM used the 6-speed transmission, and it's an excellent transmission. But the V8s, like the smaller displacement engines and the diesels, could benefit from the higher gears. Just because it's a bigger engine and it has more torque and it'll perform good with less gears, doesn't mean it won't perform better with more gears. So that's what they did. They went to the 8L90. The 8L90 right now is my favorite transmission. It was not at the beginning. If you go back and look at my videos, it had funky shifting. It had some odd characteristics that I didn't like. And it wasn't just GM. The other manufacturers, the ZFs and others with the 8 speeds, had similar issues. So 14 and 15 were not banner years for the 8L90, but fortunately a lot of the vehicles made had the 6L80 during that time period. This happens to be a 15 with an 8L90, and it had shifting issues. The customer changed it out, and like I said, it drives excellent right now. I've got to mention this for you guys that are sourcing your own components. The earlier 8L90 ran a T87 controller. They basically ran at 14, 15, and 16. The T87 is relatively easy to program with GM software and tune with HP tuners or whatever you choose. Around 17, GM got serious about encrypting and locking down their modules, and they came out with the T87A, and that changed a lot of things. The T87A is encrypted and it is locked. If you want to tune that controller, you need to send it in and have it unlocked. Now, the good side to having it unlocked and paying the money is it's an excellent controller, and I find that the later T87s really shift nice. Now, there's several reasons you might have to go with the T87A. One is that your operating system requires it. The new LT4s and such, and the newer 10-speed, the 10L80, also requires the T87A. So you're going to be pretty much stuck with that controller, and it's a great controller. You just got to pay some extra money. I wanted to put that in. After the rough start of the 8L90, it became an excellent transmission, and I love driving LTs with 8 speeds right now. It's my favorite combination. The launch out of the hole can buy you a car length or two in a race. Getting on the highway and watch it drop down below 2,000 RPM at 75 can save you gas. I just had a customer in Tucson tell me that he took his 8L90 L86 and a heavy JK, loaded down with a full tank of gas, and he ran it against a very similar JK with a 6.4 Hemi and a 5-speed. And by the end of the 8th mile, he had 5 Jeep lengths on that Hemi. And it wasn't all because of horsepower, because horsepower-wise, the Hemi actually has more horsepower. It was about the torque of that direct injected engine and the excellent gearing of the 8L90 transmission that ripped that heavy Jeep out of the hole and then kept it on the pipe all the way through the race. And this is something that's difficult to describe. Well, guys are out there pounding their chest. I got a 707 horsepower Hellcat. I got this. I got an LS3 with 700 horsepower. That's all fine. But how you get that power to the ground and how much you lose through the drivetrain is really important. So an LT with less horsepower, in general, will outrun most of the higher performance engines. It's because of the torque delivery and the excellent transmissions that we're using. So to close out the 8L90, it is an excellent transmission. It is extremely strong. Good for over 700 foot-pounds of torque. There are some caveats. Be careful of the early transmissions. But if you get a late model 8L90 transmission, you're really going to like it. Before I leave the 8L90 transmission, we have to talk about gearing. Gearing is really important. The 8L90 is basically a torque management based transmission, which means it shifts based on how much torque is applied or sensed. This is very different from transmissions of past. You supercharger guys and turbocharger guys with the JKs know what I'm talking about. So really what this test drive is about is matching the torque output of this transmission to the weight of this vehicle and the size of the tires and the gearing. Once you dial that in, this transmission shifts like butter. If you don't, you're going to still get some herky-jerky action. So torque management is a big part of how your vehicle shifts. You have to think outside of the box. You can't think like the old days, I'm going to put some shorter gears in my Jeep because it has no power. It's a V6 with 200 horsepower and my JK weighs 7,000 pounds. So you have 538s with 37s. You got to think of the LT 6.2 as a racehorse, and it wants to go. It's got so much torque, it's got so much power right off idle. If you burden it with some really short gears, it's going to take off, wind up, and really not go anywhere. And then that transmission's going to shift all whack. That engine wants to be loaded down. It has to work against something. It's like a hammer and an anvil. What good is trying to forge something if you don't have a good anvil or backup? And that's how this torque management transmission strategy works. So I have guys putting 373s in with 37s and are happy with it. Sure, they might drop out of 8th and to 7th here and there, but the reality is they're cruising down the highway at 1600 RPM and they're still launching out of the hole harder than anything they've had prior. So just remember that caveat. If you want these high gear transmissions to work, you have to gear it properly. Now what it comes down to is tuning that transmission to work with the weight of your vehicle, the size of your tires, the aerodynamic drag. You have a 6-inch lift on your Jeep with a light bar and a roof rack and everything else. That's aerodynamic drag, and that's going to change the torque output of your transmission. And it's really not that hard to do. Over the last few years, I've pretty much got it dialed in. There's only a couple of parameters that I actually have to change to dial the torque management into the vehicle. Now, we're driving a pretty average JK here. We're on 35s or 7s. It's not really that heavy, but it is a 4-door Rubicon, so it is heavy. And it shifts like an absolute dream on the highway. When you put it into 4-wheel drive range low, a lot of things change. Now you have an engine with well over 400 foot-pounds of torque, and most of that available to you right off idle. And this particular Jeep has a 241, so we've got about a 12-to-1 low ratio. Trying to apply that massive amount of torque and power with that low gear ratio can be tricky. Not long ago, I had a 15 Escalade that I did testing with, and I took it off-road. And I noticed exactly the same characteristics in the production vehicle that some of these early 15 transmissions have. Now let's move into the 10-speed. The 10-speed strategy just builds on the 8-speed high gear philosophy. And it wasn't just GM that saw this. A lot of manufacturers have recognized this. GM went in on this with Ford, Honda, Toyota. I think they all pretty much came to the conclusion, let's go to a 10-speed transmission. That's pretty much going to be the bee's knees. And instead of each of us spending countless millions of dollars developing it, let's just develop it together. And that's exactly what they did. Now, my sources at GM say the 10-speed has virtually zero issues. That's not to say they don't. The reports are not just positive, they are excellent. Now, the diversity of the gearing is a little bit better than the 8L90, but not dramatic. It is not as strong as an 8L90. I believe it's good for the mid-500s, but GM has confidence in enough to put it in their high horsepower LTs, so I'm sure it's a very strong transmission. So during my tenure here doing engine swaps, we've gone from a 2-speed to a 3-speed, to a 4-speed, to a 5-speed, to a 6-speed. Yeah, there's 7 speeds out there. I got one in my Mercedes. 8 speeds, 10 speeds. I got a 9-speed in my wife's Pacifica. So the bottom line is, when you look at an engine performance package, don't just look at the engine. Look at the transmission. Once you drive an LT with an 8L90, it's pretty much over for everything else that's out there. We're going to hit the trail with this. We're going to see if we can do some 4-wheel drive low tuning on it, and we will see you soon. Here we are, guys, off-road wheeling this 8L90 with an L86, and it's wheeling excellent. The transmission is actually working excellent. I did some tuning on it before I left the shop, so that may have made the difference, but you can see we're in tap shift mode here. We're in 4th gear, and I got to give it throttle to go down this hill, and we're going about 5 miles an hour or less. Let's see, if I were to tap shift it down and down and down, you notice the RPM match shifting? Now look at that, it practically brought me to a stop. Maybe 1 or 2 miles an hour. And by the way, guys, that's a Skydio out there. It's a fully autonomous drone. I keep my eye on it, but it pretty much avoids obstacles on its own. So 1st gear is obviously bringing me to a stop. Now what I want to notice is the flare and the idle flare when you come to a complete stop, which we're going to do now, and there really is none. Now I'm going to throttle it, let off. Now that's a throttle follower there. You notice it's not returning to idle really quick, but it is returning to idle very smoothly. And by the way, notice I'm spinning this wheel around. If my tap shift were up here, that would be difficult to operate. So you can see this throttle follower is keeping us going about 2 miles an hour. It's bumping the throttle up about 100 or 200 RPM, and that's not bad. Now I'm going to upshift it because we want to get some wheel speed up here. 2, 3. So let's go down this little hill here in 3rd gear. Actually, I'm going to bring it down 1. You can see it slowed me down just fine. I'm off the throttle. Little guy's still out there. And you can see, even on this obstacle, I'm going down in 2nd gear. But this vehicle is not, there is no idle flare, there is no herky-jerky transmission shifting, there is no upshifting and downshifting. In my opinion, it's working perfect. So I'm happy. In fact, even in 2nd gear, I got to throttle it to go down this hill. So I'm gonna put it in 2-wheel drive here because we don't need 4-wheel drive anymore. And as you can see, that transition was pretty much effortless. So we shall continue the drive.